Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining our webinar on developing a reporting taxonomy for the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. My name is Ravi, and I'll be taking you through the first section in this webinar. There should be some very small text at the bottom of the left of your screen, and that's to point out that the views expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and not necessarily those of the IFRS Foundation, nor the International Accounting Standards Board or the International Sustainability Standards Board. Before I take you through today's agenda, I think it's important to clarify that when we refer to digital reporting, we refer to digital general purpose financial reporting, which encapsulates both reporting of financial statements and sustainability related financial information. So let's begin. In today's webinar, we will be discussing the IFRS Foundation's focus and approach to digital reporting, what digital reporting is and why it has become increasingly important in a data-driven world. We will then talk about the staff draft of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and a related request for feedback, and how to get involved in the development of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, the next steps in its development, and also to take any questions from yourselves. If you have any questions during the webinar, please include them in the chat functionality, and we will address any questions at the end of the webinar. The IFRS Foundation was created in 2001 to develop globally accepted accountancy standards. Those standards, the IFRS accounting standards, are now mandated in over 140 jurisdictions and is now the de facto global accounting language. The Foundation has a three-tier governance model. The boards, being the IASB and the ISSB, are responsible to setting and maintaining the IFRS standards. The trustees are responsible for strategy and oversight of the standard setting boards and are accountable to a monitoring board of capital market authorities responsible for corporate reporting in their jurisdictions. Finally, the monitoring board are responsible for providing public accountability for the organisation. This oversight structure and established standard setting process means the IFRS Foundation is best placed to build investor-focused sustainability disclosure standards. It's important to provide context on the ISSB's focus, which is consistent with the mission of the IFRS Foundation, which is to meet the information needs of investors. The ISSB's responsibility is to develop a global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards and a taxonomy to facilitate the digital reporting of information reported in terms of the standards. In the next session, my colleague Jatin will briefly discuss what digital reporting is, and why it is important, and the role of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy in facilitating digital reporting. The IFRS taxonomies are digital taxonomies that facilitate making financial reports machine readable. They are different from green taxonomies used to classify environmental sustainable economic activities. Preparers will benefit from this global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards too, by avoiding the need for multiple requirements. The ISSB standards will enable companies to provide comprehensive and comparable information about sustainability matters in the financial markets in a timely manner. Later on in the webinar, both Aida and Owen will talk to you a bit about the two draft sustainability disclosure standards which were published for comment earlier this year. Lastly, the standards will be developed to facilitate the addition of requirements that are jurisdiction specific or aimed at a wider group of stakeholders. For example, the European Union's Planned Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, as well as the initiatives in the Americas and Oceania. Similarly, the taxonomy will also be developed to facilitate jurisdictional top-up taxonomies where applicable. As mentioned a moment ago, the ISSB and the IASB sit alongside each other within the IFRS Foundation. The IASB is responsible for developing IFRS accounting standards, And via those standards, companies are currently required to consider climate-related matters where material when preparing their financial statements. Similarly, the ISSB is responsible for developing IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, and like the IASB, will take an investor-focused approach. It is important to note that the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards are intended to be compatible with IFRS accounting standards, as well as with other generally accepted accounting principles to meet a wide range of investor needs. While both boards will remain independent and complementary to provide comprehensive financial information to investors and other providers of capital, both boards will collaborate closely to ensure there's connectivity and compatibility between the IFRS standards, and both boards will work in the public interest. Lastly, each board is responsible for the development and maintenance of a taxonomy, which will facilitate the digital consumption of financial information. In the next few slides, my colleague Jatin will briefly discuss digital reporting. Thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Ravi. My name is Jatin, and I will briefly be talking you through what digital reporting is and why it has become increasingly important in a data-driven world. As Ravi clarified, when we refer to digital reporting, we refer to digital general-purpose financial reporting, which encapsulates both reporting of financial statements and sustainability-related financial information. Financial information is reported and available in various formats. If we take PDF documents, for example, these are often structured in a manner that is visually and contextually appealing and can easily be read by humans. However, these PDF documents are not computer readable, and this makes it difficult to extract and analyze large quantities of data or text across hundreds of entities. While PDF documents may not lend themselves to efficient data analysis, there is still a use case for these reporting formats. For example, in cases where users may want to analyze a single company's reports in detail. Digital general-purpose financial reporting is the reporting of financial information in a digital format using XBRL, which transforms PDF documents into computer-readable data. The information in the static PDF documents is tagged with pieces of XBRL code, which will be maintained in the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy. This taxonomy is a key tool in facilitating digital reporting, and we will discuss more on what this taxonomy is in the next slide. Financial information that has been tagged using the structured format lends itself to greater efficiency in analyzing large amounts of data. Once financial information has been tagged using items from the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, this information then becomes computer readable and storable on a database, allowing users to query large amounts of information from such a database efficiently. And lastly, the introduction of the iXBRL format allows the best of both worlds by providing the visual, human-readable context of a PDF document with the computer-readable XBRL data coded into a single document. Before we talk about the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, it's important to understand what a taxonomy is in general. A taxonomy is a system for classifying information into categories or groups and can take a variety of forms. As Ravi mentioned earlier, the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy is not a green taxonomy, but rather it is a system for classifying and structuring sustainability-related financial data points. The IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy contains elements which are specific defined codes representing reporting concepts and are referenced to specific disclosure requirements in the standards, where each element is ascribed a name and a description. So let us take a look at the following example. Preparers of financial reports may refer to their gross Scope 1 emissions using different terms, or indeed even in different languages. However, it's not clear when looking at these line items that this is what each company intends to convey. You might be able to get some context if you look at the PDF document as a whole, but this is cumbersome and time-consuming to do for hundreds of data points. Now, if each of these preparers were to tag their financial reports using elements from the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, a user of the information, such as an investor, would know that each of these line items from these companies actually mean the same thing in this example, and thus making these items comparable. The XBRL element acts like a barcode in that it makes the information on the PDF document readable by a computer. The XBRL element or tag also contains other useful pieces of information about the tagged item, which the preparer includes when tagging their financial reports. Owen will speak a bit more on how the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy will be developed later on in this webinar. So, why is digital financial reporting important? We live in the information age, and increasingly more information is becoming available to investors, including sustainability-related financial information. By digitalizing financial reports, information in those reports becomes machine readable, allowing investors to access and analyze information more efficiently, including information in foreign languages. Digital financial reporting provides opportunities to improve capital market efficiency and potentially reduce cost of capital, as investors would be able to analyze information and make capital market decisions much quicker. Digital financial reporting can also assist regulators in their market oversight activities and enforcement reviews. And lastly, over 90 or roughly 90% of public companies by market capitalization are now required to undertake some form of digital financial reporting. These jurisdictions include the US, China, the European Union, Japan, the UK, India, Korea, and South Africa. And while there are challenges in the adoption of digital reporting practices, there is a clear global trend towards facilitating and implementing digital reporting. I will now hand over to Aida, who will talk you through recent technical developments and the staff draft taxonomy.
Thank you so much, Jatin, for this very insightful introduction, and hi, everyone. So my name is Aida, and I will provide a brief overview of the context for the staff draft, as well as related requests for feedback before I hand over to Owen to explain some of the staff recommendations that we have put out in this document. So in order to help ISSB facilitate digital reporting of the sustainability-related financial information from the outset, we, as in IFRS Foundation staff, have developed a staff draft of a possible taxonomy for sustainability-related financial reporting. And this staff draft is accompanied by a staff paper outlining our key recommendations in developing the proposed possible taxonomy. At a later date, ISSB is going to publish a proposed taxonomy that will be open for public consultation following the IFRS Foundation due process. Now, let's say a few words around the basis for this staff draft, which is the two exposure drafts that the ISSB published earlier in the year. So the ISSB, as Ravi mentioned earlier, sought feedback on two proposed standards: General Requirement Standards S1 that you see on the left-hand side here, and Climate Standard S2 on the right-hand side. These two exposure drafts were out for 120-day comment period that ended end of July, and we have received over 1,300 comment letters in response to those, and feedback on that you can now see in papers that are posted on the IFRS website, which ISSB is going to discuss in their meeting next week. So just a few words about each of the exposure drafts. So the draft of S1 sets out overall requirements for disclosing sustainability-related financial information about all sustainability-related risks and opportunities. The objective being to provide the users with complete set of sustainability-related financial disclosures. These disclosures would be centered on companies' considerations of its governance, strategy, and risk management, as well as metrics and targets it uses to measure, monitor, and manage its sustainability-related risks and opportunities. This approach is consistent with recommendations of the TCFD, but extends them to sustainability-related risks and opportunities beyond those related to climate. Now moving on to the second exposure draft, the draft of IFRS S2, climate-related disclosures, which sets out specific requirements to identify, measure, and disclose climate-related financial information. The climate exposure draft is also built upon TCFD, as well as SASB climate-related industry-based requirements. So when an entity applying IFRS S1 would identify climate-related risks as a matter to report to, then it would apply the requirements in the S2 to provide the related disclosures. So these two exposure drafts are very much the basis on which the staff draft of a possible taxonomy for sustainability-related reporting was prepared. But the staff draft is not the only place where digital reporting and taxonomy was considered. So the two exposure drafts I just explained also included a question related to digital reporting, asking for feedback on drafting that might have effect on digital reporting or any other comments. And I'm very pleased to share with you that we have received lots of feedback supporting ISSB in developing digital taxonomy for sustainability-related financial reporting. So let's move on and say a few words about the due process that the ISSB is following. So the ISSB is following the same high-quality due process that ISB has been following as set out by the trustees of the IFRS Foundation, and this extends to the due process for taxonomy development. So what this means is that any new taxonomy content arising from the new ISSB standards, including the accompanying materials, would be developed by the IFRS Foundation staff, but would be subject to approval by the ISSB through a formal balloting process. And the purpose of this approval is for the ISSB to be satisfied that taxonomy is reflecting the requirements in the standards and nothing more, and that those requirements are appropriately reflected. So the aim is to publish a proposed taxonomy soon after the new standards are issued, and then that will be out for public consultation, as well as discussion with our taxonomy consultative group. After that, ISSB will consider the feedback received before finalizing the taxonomy. So you can see on the slide, this is all happening after the standard is finalized. But we have started early, and we have, as a team, developed a staff draft of a possible taxonomy to help ISSB develop the taxonomy following the steps are laid out on a timely basis. This is therefore not a replacement or a change in the due process, but simply additional step we are doing because there is quite a lot of matters to consider, fundamental matters, as Owen is going to explain later on, and we thought it is good to start early and get some research and outreach done. So here we are with the staff draft and a comments letter feedback that is going to end in a few weeks' time. So let's see on the next slide what is included in this staff draft package. So we have prepared a few things for your consideration. So the actual taxonomy is produced two ways. One is the XBRL files, so machine-readable format, as well as human-readable form, where we have prepared taxonomy elements in a PDF. And not only that, but we have accompanied these lists of elements with a document that we called Staff Request for Feedback, in which we lay out fundamental matters that need to be considered and the things that we needed to decide on in developing this staff draft. So just another caveat, as I explained when going over previous slide on the due process, so this staff draft is not a required due process step, it's an additional step, and this is not therefore a formal due process document subject to formal consultation, nor is it approved by the ISSB. So ISSB is going to approve proposed taxonomy that's going to come out after it finalizes the standards S1 and S2. So now we've clarified that. Let's just look at this wonderful picture that lays out the 9 fundamental matters that we have considered in developing the staff draft. And as I said this morning, I could try to paint a little bit of a picture of this, but Owen does a much better job. So this is a great opportunity now for me to hand over to Owen to explain our recommendations in each of these areas. So over to you, Owen.
Thank you, Aida. So as Aida mentioned, I'm now going to talk you through the various fundamental matters that we considered when putting together the staff draft and that we asked questions on in the staff request for feedback. So moving on to the first question that we were looking at, the fundamental question was, how should we prepare and manage the taxonomy representation of the ISSB standards? What we wanted to understand was how the basic technical structure of the taxonomy and how we might package or arrange it would impact on the practical use of the taxonomy and electronic reporting in various jurisdictions. We wanted to consider, for example, jurisdictions that have or haven't adopted IFRS accounting standards and that have or do not yet have widespread digital financial reporting. We also wanted to consider those that use the IFRS accounting taxonomy as the basis of digital reporting and those that don't. And also, of course, we need to consider those who will adopt the ISSB standards as they are, or use them as a foundational baseline for more extensive local requirements. In addition to this, we obviously have 2 separate boards approving 2 sets of standards, which makes certain arrangements more practical. Taking all those factors into consideration, we've illustrated in the staff draft of the taxonomy what we think is a crucial first decision: to separate the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy from the IFRS Accounting Taxonomy, package each of them as an independent component. That will enable the Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy to be used together with the IFRS Accounting Taxonomy, where that makes sense, but also to be used alongside other accounting taxonomies in jurisdictions that adopt the ISSB standards, but either don't use IFRS accounting standards or don't use the IFRS Accounting Taxonomy. We also wanted to design the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy so that it could potentially be used as a building block in jurisdictions that go beyond the baseline requirements of the ISSB standards. Jurisdictions could address their additional disclosure requirements through a jurisdictionally specific top-up taxonomy they would create, allowing for tagging of those additional requirements, while the foundational parts of the disclosures would still be tagged identically across all jurisdictions, and so easily used and compared globally. The next question we wanted to address and consider was taxonomy layout. Taxonomy layout addresses how the items within the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy will be presented in order to promote ease of navigation and ease of use of the taxonomy for preparers of digital financial information. Effective grouping of the items within the taxonomy helps preparers to navigate, understand, and use the taxonomy, which facilitates efficient digital consumption of financial information. These presentation groups are not intended to dictate how preparers should prepare their financial reports, but rather are intended to promote ease of navigation and understandability of the taxonomy, to help people find the right taxonomy item to use to tag a piece of their report or to find the data that they are interested in. Now, the basic layout of sustainability-related financial information is expected to vary more than the basic layout of financial information, which is fairly consistent from reporter to reporter, with different preparers choosing to arrange their reporting along different lines. Because of this, the staff proposed that items within the taxonomy should be grouped into 2 different presentation groups to assist preparers in identifying appropriate items that represent their disclosed information. The first grouping we suggested is by standard, where items are grouped based on the draft Sustainability Disclosure Standard from which they are drawn. This would be consistent with the grouping of elements in the IFRS accounting taxonomy, in which elements from new or amended standards are organised into the presentation group to which that standard relates. This arrangement would aid preparers who may report their sustainability-related financial information following the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, or simply think about their reporting from that perspective. The second grouping we considered and suggested was by aspect of core content, in which the same items that were in the first grouping would be arranged instead based on the 4 aspects of core content preparers may be familiar with from TCFD: governance, strategy, risk management, and targets and metrics. This grouping would bring together the requirements from all the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, viewing them instead by these 4 aspects of core content. That could aid any preparers who might organise their sustainability-related financial disclosures to address each of the core content aspects in turn. Staff have also recommended a third grouping containing the industry-based metrics, which would not be in the other 2 groupings, organised by industry. This is expected to reflect reporting practice, where these more detailed disclosures are often provided in a distinct section of the report. We work closely with the ISSB team throughout the development of our staff draft taxonomy to ensure it's consistent with the ISSB taxonomy. The next issue we discussed was narrative information, and in particular, the degree of detail we should ask preparers to provide for narrative information. Investors use narrative information differently than numeric information. For example, numbers are used to directly compare between companies and periods. Consequently, it's often useful to capture each reported number separately and identify them all. For example, specifically labelling an entity's profit or loss for the year. In contrast, narrative information often needs to be read in context and can be less directly comparable than numeric information. Because of this, larger pieces of text covering topics in a more consistent way might be more useful than the smallest possible piece of information you could consider required by the standards. Basically, the question is, at what degree of detail should we expect preparers to identify specific items of information within their general purpose financial restatements? In deciding on what items to include in the taxonomy, ultimately it's a balancing act, finding a trade-off between the effort required by preparers to tag their reports and the usefulness of that tagged information to the use of the disclosures. Items that are too broad in the information that they capture lead to less useful pieces of information, whereas items that are too narrow or too specific may lead to users needing to query multiple items and piece various bits of information together in order to find useful information, and also can impose a lot of effort on preparers tagging their reports. Having considered these factors, the proposal that we included in the staff draft and asked for feedback on in the request for feedback was to create distinct items for narrative information when, in our opinion, the information is expected to be separately understandable to users and to also be relatively easily identified for tagging in reports. To meet that objective, we recommended creating items corresponding to the proposed requirements in the sub-paragraphs of the standards, because that was the level at which they typically resulted in distinct and coherent disclosures. We also recommended creating items corresponding to the paragraphs that reflect a whole disclosure objective or a whole core content aspect. These would capture any remaining information not reflected in specific sub-paragraphs. As I noted, this is a balancing act, and we would very much appreciate feedback from both preparers and users of sustainability disclosures on whether these principles are correct and whether we are broadly striking the right balance in the elements we have actually proposed. Some narrative disclosures, such as when a disclosure essentially includes a categorical yes or no answer or a choice from a specific list of options, are more similar to numeric information, and they are directly comparable between entities and across periods quite easily. If such data were actually provided by preparers in their digital reporting in a categorical format, by which I mean as multiple choice, rather than just as text and alongside that text, primary users would be able to use that information to quickly search databases, to compare across companies, and for the same company across periods, without needing to interpret textual disclosures of each entity, which could vary in their form, in their shape, in their location, and of course be presented in multiple languages. Here you can see some examples of categorical items we proposed including in the taxonomy. We have suggested Boolean items to be used where the answers for tagging are either true or false. And we've also found enumeration type items which allow a fixed list of predetermined answers. The ISSB incorporated the climate-related disclosure requirements of the SASB standards into the S2 climate-related disclosures exposure draft. Industry-based disclosures requirements identify, measure, and disclose information related to significant climate-related risks and opportunities associated with particular industries. In the SASB standards, these industry-based metrics were grouped by sector, by industry, and then by disclosure topic, and each metric was ascribed a code, which linked those elements to the metric. Around this time last year, SASB published a taxonomy representing the structure, the reporting requirements in the SASB standards. Their taxonomy closely followed the layout of the standards and that hierarchy of sector, industry, disclosure topic, and metric. This structure made the process of searching for the correct item to tag disclosures efficient and clear for preparers. There's a strong continuity between the SASB standards and the ISSB's S2 exposure draft. The S2 industry-based requirements are closely derived from the SASB standards and follow exactly the same structure and coding. Given this, the approach we recommended in the staff draft taxonomy was to leverage the work previously done by SASB on their taxonomy, and we worked closely with the SASB staff to incorporate this into our taxonomy. We've used identical names for equivalent items and followed a very similar presentation of those items in the taxonomy. We've proposed some changes compared to the SASB taxonomy in order to align with the draft S2 requirements. These include making some of the metrics more internationally applicable and including metrics for disclosures about financed emissions. General requirements exposure draft requires entities to describe the relationships between pieces of information, either within the sustainability disclosures or between sustainability and financial disclosures. For example, where the disclosure of use of scarce natural resources could be related to the disclosure of the risk of natural resource shortages and on to potential financial impacts in, for example, loss of sales or changes in prices. We looked at whether connected information should be represented in the digital form, but so far we have not recommended a specific method of capturing these connections, other than by simply block tagging the text in which they're discussed. In a request for feedback, we ask if other more specific digital tools should perhaps be used to improve the digital accessibility of information that describes these connections between related disclosures. What use, for example, might consumers of sustainability disclosures wish to make of these connections, and what information would therefore need to be captured about them to facilitate those uses? And what technological approaches could be taken? We also discussed cross-referencing and the implications of it. The general requirements exposure draft permits a preparer to include information by way of cross-reference to another report, where this information forms part of the complete set of sustainability-related financial disclosures. However, if information is included in the report by cross-reference and the information itself exists in another document, could there perhaps be a risk that that information in that other report may not be tagged, and thus that the digital representation of the sustainability report could be incomplete? Although we considered this topic, for now, the staff recommended that requirements related to cross-references should not be explicitly modelled in the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, partly because no suitable taxonomy level modelling approach was identified that addressed all the concerns on this topic. Instead, we think this is an area that will depend on how reporting regimes in jurisdictions choose to handle questions about what cross-references are allowed, and if and how such reference documents should be submitted as part of digital financial reporting. As with all of the topics I've mentioned, this is an area where we're looking for your thoughts, opinions and ideas in order to develop an IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and, more generally, a digital financial reporting process for sustainability disclosures that works the best it can for everyone involved in the process, regulators, preparers and users of the information alike. On that note, I'll now hand over to my colleague Madhu to discuss how you can help shape the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and the work of the ISSB more generally.
Thank you very much, Owen. My name is Mathew. I'm very much part of the IFRS Foundation digital reporting team. And before that, I was actually part of the ISSB team that built the ISSB taxonomy. So as Owen was mentioning, over the last several months, we've collaborated together to bring in those industry-specific metrics that Owen mentioned into the ISSB taxonomy. So now let's talk about how you can be involved in building the, help improving and building the Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy and shape the future of digital reporting. So like Aida mentioned, what we have today is the staff draft of the taxonomy and the staff request for feedback. Now, these are two very early releases, so as to speak. The reason, like Aida mentioned, is we want to have a robust digital reporting strategy. And for that, we need to make sure we design the taxonomy the best way possible. So the fundamental matters that Owen mentioned are very critical here. So we need you to be involved. We need you to provide feedback so that we are able to build it the right way from the get-go. So two ways, there's a survey and then there's a comment letter process due by September 30th. The link is on the slide here. Please do participate. Your feedback is really, really important. And then as Aida mentioned, this information, the feedback that you provide goes into building the exposure draft taxonomy later when ISSB finalizes S1 and S2. As soon as those standards are finalized and released, we will have the next iteration of taxonomy for called the exposure draft, and we'll have public consultation on it. So in the next slide, I think I probably mentioned this already. So here, the idea, what I'm trying to say here is, once you get the feedback that you provide for the staff draft, that goes into the ISSB board for consideration. And after the S1 and S2 are finalized, shortly thereafter, you'll have the exposure draft of the taxonomy released for public consultation. So beyond taxonomy, there are other ways you can participate and help us. One great way to do that would be to participate in the ISSB's meetings. So in Frankfurt, the week of September 19th, meetings are taking place. These meetings are streamed live, so you are able to observe online. Please do take the opportunity to participate. The meeting papers should have been published by now. And if you're not able to participate online, the meeting summary should be published on or after 26 September. Again, the link to registering and signing up are on the slide here. Please do consider participating. So that's pretty much it. Now I think we'll shift over to questions. Over to you, Ravi.
In fact, I'm going to hand over to Aida, who's going to very much care the questions.
Oh, Ravi, are you sure? Well, it feels like I should ask you the first question now, Ravi. Thank you so much, Madhu, and thank you for questions that have started coming, and please keep them coming. So one of the first questions received was where we can see the human readable format of the taxonomy, and I hope that You can all see it on your screens now. I don't know exactly what your screen looks like, but hopefully you can find it there. Our colleagues have just posted the link to our website that includes in the supporting materials section of the work on sustainability taxonomy, the links to both human readable and machine readable formats for the taxonomy, which you can produce. So I hope that's helpful. So as I promised, Ravi, you get the first question, and one of the questions we received was, when will the S1 and S2 be finalized?
That is a very good question. So we're currently busy, or have been busy, reviewing close to 1,300 comment letter responses to S1 and S2, and the team have done an excellent job in summarising that those comments. And if you log on to the IFRS website, you'll be able to actually review the summary of feedback for both of those documents. And it's expected, that over the coming months, there's going to be lots of discussions from members, but also deliberations on what to do next. So we're working at speed, but ensuring that quality remains. So hopefully that addresses that question there, Aida.
Thank you so much, Ravi. And as you said, because all the feedback is on our website as well as the exposure drafts themselves, I'm not going to ask you to answer a question that was asking for a reminder of the content of S1 and S2. That will probably take us the reminder of the time that we have for this webinar, that is about taxonomy. So if I can leave our participants to read those materials on the website for reminders and for the summary of the feedback, as well as plan to finalize the standards. So if we move on, let's maybe go to you, Owen, and we had some questions around working with different jurisdictions and the requirements they are developing, the taxonomies that are developing. Can you maybe explain how is IFRS Foundation working with them, and what's going to happen there?
Yes, so I can say that the ISSB has a jurisdictional working group, where we're trying to coordinate with the SEC, EFRAG, and various other entities on the general overview of the standards, and that we're also conversing with all the various jurisdictional areas on developing the taxonomies and seeing how we can align those. Obviously, the degree to which the taxonomy can help or can support the alignment of standards is very much dependent on the degree to which the standards become aligned. So the work in that jurisdictional working group is vitally important. I don't know, Ravi, if you wanted to add some more about how that working group is constructed.
Yeah, of course. I think you've done an excellent job there, Owen. So I don't think there's any top-up required, apart from the fact that the taxonomy is very much governed by what's in the actual standards itself. And we've heard, loud and clear by the actual review of the comments for the interoperability of the ISSB against other jurisdictional requirements. We're working via that jurisdictional working group to make this a reality, bearing in mind that this is a complex landscape. So, but yeah, I think you did an excellent job there, Owen. So nothing else to add. So perhaps back over to yourself, Aida.
Thank you so much, both of you. And yeah, we have these questions coming down, so I'm quickly skimming through, and there is one for you, Madhu, on SASB and the many standards that SASB has developed, and what will happen with them. Are they all going to be adopted by the ISSB? Can you comment on that?
Sure. I think with S2, the focus has been on climate-related industry metrics. So you will see that included as part of the taxonomy. And like Ravi mentioned earlier, there were some changes made to make it more international, and then metrics related to financed emissions were added as well. So the rest of the metrics, which are not climate related, are currently going through the IFRS due process, are being reviewed, and the plan is to eventually incorporate them in. So that is post the due process. In the meantime, the SASB standards continue to be available to the market. The SASB taxonomy is also available to the market, and we are committed to supporting those till a time when ISSB completely brings in the rest of the metrics.
Thank you so much, Madhu, for that explanation that I'm sure many people watching us are very interested in. There's some kind of taxonomy questions here as well, and here's one for you, Jatin. So there's a question of, please just remind us of what will the taxonomy look like, how will be presented. Do you want to, I know we touched on this already, but it's probably useful to remind everyone. So do you want to walk through that again?
Sure, thanks, Aida. So what will the taxonomy look like? It's a question with many perspectives. So the taxonomy effectively is coding, which would appear in a sort of an XML file, and that is computer readable. But I think the more important perspective is how would it look like to humans and how we would be able to consume it. So the foundation would publish a ITI, IFRS Taxonomy Illustrated, in both PDF and Excel versions. And that allows humans to sort of read the document and identify the elements, the presentation groups to which the elements are related, as well as any sort of relationships between the hierarchical relationships between the elements. And the presentation groups that we have proposed in our staff draft taxonomy is to group the elements first by the aspect of core content, first by standard, and then by the aspect of core content. And that's one way. Another way of viewing the taxonomy is through the IFRS Standards Navigator, which is an online tool provided by the IFRS Foundation, which allows you to scroll through the standard on a web page and have a look at the taxonomy related to the disclosure requirements on that web page as well. So there you'd see a closer link between the actual taxonomy elements and the disclosure requirements that prompt those taxonomy elements. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much for this, Jatin, for that explanation. And a few more taxonomy related questions. So here's another perhaps helpful question for reminder for everyone, Owen. And the question is, please let us know. So does this mean taxonomy, there will be taxonomy elements for each individual requirement in the standards, or how do you decide when to have a taxonomy element? So Owen, you touched on this a little bit, especially talking about narratives, but it might be useful to give a bit of overview again, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you, Aida. That's a good question. So yes, the taxonomy, the elements we include in the taxonomy, items we put in the taxonomy, are completely derived from the standards. They do directly connect with the requirements in the standards. Where those requirements are simple numbers, then it's fairly clear that we'll create an element that matches with that number and describes it quite well. The interesting question, as you say, comes when you're talking about narrative elements, where the question of whether you talk about, quite often the standards will be structured in explain something about governance, and in that discussion you have to hit this point and this point and this point. Whether we create a taxonomy element for each of those smaller requirements really will depend on balancing, as we discussed earlier, that how much value does identifying that particular concept, that particular piece of reporting have to the use of the information versus how much effort is it for the preparers to identify those separate pieces. So that's something we'll try and have a feedback process with people, with the market on, try and get something we'd love information on from a request for feedback as to which of the elements people are actually interested in. It's also the kind of thing that we will do some targeted market outreach to talk to people, and that of course as the taxonomy is introduced and then is used over time, we'll be able to get feedback on what's actually being done, how it's being used in reporting, and how people are finding it in tagging, and then we'll be able to adjust the taxonomy to get that level right. One of the ways we'll do that, for example, is through post-implementation review of the taxonomy, whether it's how it's being used after a while, and also continuously through a common practice process where we will look at the reporting that's out there and to see whether we've got the right elements to identify and to allow people to tag those efficiently.
Thank you so much for that, Owen. So you explained not only relationship with the requirements, but also that this is not a static process, but that we are continuing the work and refine and improve taxonomy as it is used in practice. So we have a few more questions here. One for you, Madhu, and there's a question around how will ISSB's relationship with software providers compare to what SASB and the way the SASB has been working? And I know we still are in development here, but I just wonder if there's anything you'd like to say in comment to that at this point.
That's a very good question. Thanks. Thank you for the question. I think the idea here is market continuity. I think that is very important. So in the past with SASB, we've worked very closely with software providers to help them integrate the standards into their platforms. I think the thinking and the approach is very much the same. We want our ISSB standards to be integrated into the market as much as possible to enable digital reporting. So in principle, I think the idea is to continue and help the market as much as we can.
And thank you so much, Madhu. And in that vein, Ravi, we also had a question around accessibility and asking, is taxonomy going to be free, in particular to companies that will need to use it to tag their financial reporting? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, of course. Great question. Thank you ever so much. Simple answer, yes, it's going to be free. So there may be some, yeah, it's going to be free. I don't know how to elaborate beyond that. So the taxonomy will be developed via, via the due process, and we'll reach out to the market following the finalisation of the proposed S1 and S2. And once that's out for consultation, we'll receive your feedback and finalise the actual taxonomy and release this for the public. So it's very much a public good, and it's for free.
Absolutely, very much in tune with the vision of the IFRS Foundation to work in public interest, right? Ravi, whilst you were still there, there was another question of, is taxonomy going to be developed no matter what feedback we receive, or is there an option of ISSB not proceeding to develop a taxonomy? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, of course, and thank you ever so much to the participant who asked that question. So it's a common question, in fact. We received it in the earlier session as well, so hopefully I should be well versed on this. So the response is that, via the actual due process handbook, there is a requirement to actually release a taxonomy. And just building upon my previous response, the expectation is that once we finalise S1 and S2, we will subsequently shortly go out with an exposure draft on the actual taxonomy to do with the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy. So it's in the due process handbook, and you should see this shortly after finalisation of their standards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for that. And Owen, we had several questions about engagement and importance of engagement for different jurisdictions. And I know we covered that early on in the Q&A, but the questions have kept coming, asking specifically, are we continuing engagement with the IFRAG, with the SEC? So it might be just useful, say, few more words about what we are doing and reinforce that message if you like to come in.
Yes, so indeed we are working as close as we can with IFRAG and the SEC, both at the standards level and at a technical level, to try and bring things as close together as possible, and to make things as easy as possible for reporters. We're working at sort of quietly at a technical level to try and get taxonomies to be aligned where they can be. And I know, as I said earlier, there is a jurisdictional working group that the ISSB runs, so working at the standards level to try and work out where those things can be aligned. And I know there's a lot of interest on all sides in making the standards as aligned as possible.
Thank you. I managed to lose my mute button, but I found it. So thank you so much, Owen, for that. And just to clarify, does this mean that taxonomy can then help with interoperability, even if the underlying requirements are not identical? Do you want to comment on that?
Part. The important point of the taxonomy is, as we said, it allows people to identify what parts of their reports represent and fulfill which reporting requirements. And it's important that you correctly identify the reporting requirements you've fulfilled, and that what you're tagging actually meets that definition. So where those standards are using the same definitions for things and are asking for disclosure of the same information, then yes, the taxonomy can help. Aligning taxonomies can help people to identify those as being the same pieces of information reported under both mandates. Where the standards are not aligned, the important thing is not to make false comparability by identifying things that don't really fulfill the requirements of one standard as doing so. And so that's where taxonomy can't solve everything. You can't use a taxonomy to paper over the differences in standards where they are fundamental differences.
Thank you so much, Owen. That's very important message for everyone to know. So we are merely representing requirements in the standards, and that is a role and not something else. So there's a few more questions have come in. Madhu, you talked about the next steps and the work we are doing on finalizing, and we'll be doing on finalizing. And we had a specific question come in on what work we are doing on testing our recommendations in the staff draft and going forward, testing that taxonomy works. Again, this is work in process, I know, but I wonder if you want to comment on this briefly.
Sure. Testing is important. So what we've done is a very targeted outreach effort where we're working with issuers or preparers who have produced SASB reports in the past and TCFD reports in the past, and where their reporting is identical to S1 and S2. So we're able to take those reports and see how the taxonomy performs on those reports. So it's a very targeted outreach. We are doing this early on so that we learn from it, and then we are able to design the taxonomy better. And the focus is around the fundamental matters that Owen mentioned previously. So those design questions, like we said before, are critical. So once again, I'm going to plug in. Feedback is very important, so please do provide feedback.
Thank you, Madhu. And Madhu might have been breaking for some, but I hope you heard. Your feedback is very important, and please provide us feedback. By 30th of September, and or in the later stages as we work towards development. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I have a couple of questions left as well. One for you, Jatin. You had earlier discussed about what will taxonomy look like and the two ways we will be presenting taxonomy. And we had a question asking, does this mean that the companies will have to present their sustainability-related financial information following the layout of the taxonomy in their paper reporting? Could you maybe explain how that works, please?
Thanks, Aida. That's a very good question. Ultimately, the taxonomy doesn't dictate or propose how a preparer should set out their sustainability-related reports. That's entirely up to the preparer. And indeed, that can take a variety of different forms. When we suggested our presentation groups for the staff draft taxonomy, we did so in a manner that would hopefully cater to a variety of preparers and a variety of ways that they may end up disclosing or preparing their reports. And it's not intended to dictate how those reports should be laid out, but rather it's intended to help the preparer find the correct element when they have prepared their reports and are now tagging those reports using the taxonomy. So the presentation groups don't in any way correlate to or dictate how a preparer should set out their reports, but rather how a preparer could find the correct element when they are tagging their sustainability-related reports. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, and that's really important, and thank you for that explanation, Jatin. So taxonomy in no way dictates the presentation. It is really there just to facilitate. And a final question for you, Ravi. We had quite a few questions actually about other topics such as social disclosures, and when will ISSB work on those, if you want to comment on that briefly.
Yeah, of course. The ISSB technical staff are not only working on S1 and S2 and the finalisation of that with the actual board members, we're actually working on requests for feedback on what should the ISSB do next. So that's ultimately called an agenda priority consultation. If you're really inquisitive, you can read the papers from July, which are really eye-opening, if I say so myself. We're looking to actually get those documents out for your public comment very shortly. Can't put any specific dates on that at the moment, but perhaps yeah, very shortly. So and then stay tuned on next steps on that. So I think we're at time now, so I'll hand over to yourself, Aida.
I think so, and quite a lot going on, isn't there? And we will continue to be busy and hopefully even more busy because of all the comment letters you're going to send us following this webinar today, providing us with your inputs on the recommendations in the staff draft to help ISSB develop digital taxonomy on a timely basis. And with that, I just want to thank you all for your time today, for your questions and participation. We hope you found this webinar useful, and we will probably be in touch with another webinar once we have developed proposed taxonomy with the ISSB. So with that, thank you very much and goodbye.